Dr. Elias Thorne, a historian specializing in Cold War-era clandestine technological projects, felt the familiar dry dust of the archives settle on his fingertips as he sifted through another box of declassified Project Grapple procurement records. Years spent navigating the labyrinthine declassifications of the US government had taught him patience, a deep appreciation for oblique references, and a healthy skepticism towards official narratives. Most of his colleagues fixated on the well-trodden paths: U-2 development, the early satellite programs, the dawn of stealth technology epitomized by the folklore surrounding Groom Lake, better known now by its colloquial moniker, Area 51. Thorne, however, was drawn to the footnotes, the marginalia, the projects that seemed to fade from the historical record almost as soon as they appeared. He was looking for echoes, for parallel developments that might have occurred away from the spotlight, perhaps even shielded from the spotlight of other highly classified efforts. His current focus was a series of budget summaries from the late 1950s, detailing expenditures related to advanced atmospheric research platforms and novel energy acquisition systems. These weren't standard aerospace line items. They were categorized under a project designation, CHALICE, that he'd seen before, always briefly, always linked to a different set of contractors and agencies than the usual players in the aircraft development world. What piqued his interest this afternoon was a cross-reference in a memo concerning material procurement for high-temperature alloys. It mentioned delivery to Site B4, Basin Annex. Basin Annex. The term wasn't in any index of known Cold War facilities he possessed. The number B4 was equally unfamiliar in that context. Groom Lake was often referred to by area numbers or project code names, but never Basin Annex. The memo placed it geographically within the Great Basin region, broad enough to encompass parts of Nevada, Utah, Oregon, and California, but specifically within the restricted airspace corridor associated with the Nevada test site and adjacent military lands. It was a region already synonymous with secrecy, but this particular designation was new. Thorne leaned back, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. He pulled out a well-worn spiral notebook filled with his cryptic notes and cross-referenced CHALICE. The scattered references suggested a project that ran concurrently with, but separate from, the main thrust of the CIA's U-2 program and the Air Force's early experimental aircraft. While those programs focused on pushing the boundaries of conventional aerodynamics, jet propulsion, and stealth, the CHALICE references hinted at something different. Keywords like non-conventional lift, plasma confinement, zero-point flux potential, and trans-medium vehicles appeared in associated technical reports, terms that, while possibly jargon for highly advanced but still conventional physics, felt ambitious, even for that era of rapid technological leaps. The idea began to form. What if, in the frantic post-war race to exploit every possible avenue of technological advantage derived from captured German science and indigenous research, the US government hadn't put all its eggs in one basket? What if the focus on advanced airframes and propulsion at places like Groom Lake was just one track, and another, perhaps even more speculative and higher-risk track, was pursued simultaneously elsewhere? A twin project, born of the same strategic imperative and historical moment but focused on entirely different, perhaps more fundamental physics. And if such a project existed, what happened to it? The records for CHALICE seemed to dry up by the mid-1960s, or rather, they became even more opaque, swallowed by deeper levels of classification. Thorne knew the official story. Exotic projects were explored, some failed, some succeeded, and were integrated into conventional programs like stealth. And some, were simply abandoned as infeasible with the technology of the time. Area 51's mystique grew from the publicly explained U-2, SR-71, and the partially leaked stealth prototypes, leaving just enough gaps for alien theories to take root. But what if the real, deepest secret wasn't about who visited Earth, but about how the US was trying to mimic or develop technologies that seemed utterly alien at the time? He spent the rest of the afternoon tracking down every instance of Basin Annex or Site B4 he could find. There were frustratingly few. A logistical manifest listed delivery of specialized power conditioning units and high-frequency resonant emitters to a rail spur near a desolate, unnamed dry lake bed in southwestern Utah, roughly 150 miles east-northeast of Groom Lake. A map from a geological survey of the 1950s showed an unimproved government road branching off a state highway, leading towards a remote canyon system in the same general vicinity. The road simply ended on the map, marked restricted access. The picture was fragmented, incomplete, but persistent. It wasn't much. Certainly not enough for a peer-reviewed paper or even a serious journal article. It was just a persistent anomaly in the historical record, a phantom limb of the Cold War technological race. But it was enough to shift Thorne's focus. Area 51 was history, its major secrets largely declassified or widely speculated upon with a high degree of accuracy. But if there was a twin facility, one focused on radically different technology, one that didn't enter the public consciousness even as a rumor mill like Area 51 did, what did that mean? And the real, chilling possibility, if it was focused on fundamental physics breakthroughs rather than just airframes, could it still be active today, pursuing research avenues that remained far beyond the public or even mainstream scientific understanding? The reference to Basin Annex felt less like a historical footnote and more like a breadcrumb leading into a deeper, still-living mystery. He packed his notes, the dust motes dancing in the fading light filtering through the archive windows. His next step wouldn't be in the archives. It would be in the field. Thorne's preliminary online searches for Site B4 or Basin Annex yielded predictable results. Nothing official. A few conspiracy forums linking it vaguely to underground bases or alien contacts, standard fare for any remote government site. But no credible historical analysis or even persistent local legend distinct from the general Area 51 overflow. This lack of public footprint was, ironically, more compelling than any wild claim. Area 51 thrived on rumors, leaks, and eventual partial admissions. This Basin Annex seemed genuinely erased, or perhaps never allowed to leave a trace in the public sphere at all. It suggested a level of compartmentalization and secrecy that exceeded even the legendary black projects of the era. He cross-referenced the rail spur location mentioned in the logistical manifest with historical satellite imagery available through publicly accessible databases, older corona and hexagon imagery, declassified in later decades. The resolution wasn't high enough to show details of a facility in the 1960s, but it did show a significant amount of activity around that rail spur and the unimproved road during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Temporary construction camps, significant vehicle traffic patterns leading into the canyon area identified on the geological map, and signs of ground clearing activity deep within the canyon itself. By the mid-1960s, this activity seemed to decrease on the satellite imagery, but the road remained, and faint traces of infrastructure could be discerned, nestled deep within the rugged terrain. It looked less like an airbase, and more like something built into the landscape, perhaps underground or within the canyon walls. He spent weeks poring over geological maps of the region. The canyon system, part of a lesser-known mountain range bordering the Great Basin, was characterized by deep, narrow ravines carved into ancient volcanic rock and sedimentary layers. It was seismically stable, remote, and offered natural cover. The specific area where the unimproved road ended was marked by a small, high plateau overlooking a particularly deep and inaccessible part of the canyon, ideal for concealment. Thorne decided the next step was to visit the area, not to trespass, not to look for aliens, but to observe the terrain, understand the logistics of building something there, and perhaps glean any faint modern-day clues that wouldn't appear in historical documents. He wasn't expecting flashing lights or guarded fences right off the highway. He expected subtle signs, changes in road maintenance, unexpected security patrols far from any obvious installation, or perhaps electromagnetic interference that shouldn't be there. He planned a road trip, framing it to anyone who asked, few did, as research into Cold War infrastructure in the Great Basin, focusing on auxiliary sites. He rented a nondescript SUV, packed camping gear, cameras with powerful telephoto lenses, a high-sensitivity electromagnetic field meter borrowed from a physicist colleague, ostensibly for tracking power line interference, and detailed maps, old and new. He chose a route that would take him close to, but not directly towards, the suspected location initially. He wanted to spend time in the surrounding small towns, absorbing the local atmosphere, perhaps picking up on any persistent, generations-old whispers that might have a kernel of truth beneath layers of speculation. The drive into the Great Basin was an exercise in appreciating emptiness. Vast, stark landscapes unfolded under an immense sky. Towns were few and far between, existing primarily to serve the scattered ranches, mining operations, often long abandoned, and the distant, looming presence of government land. The air was dry, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. This was a region where secrets could easily be swallowed by the sheer scale of the geography. His first stop was a small town 50 miles south of the suspected location. He ate at a local diner, listening to the conversations around him. They revolved around cattle prices, the weather, and the perennial lack of rain. No talk of strange lights, unusual sounds, or overly watchful strangers. He tried asking oblique questions to the diner owner, an elderly woman who had lived there her whole life, about local history, old government projects in the area. She mentioned the proving grounds, the Air Force base hundreds of miles away, the persistent rumors about Area 51 over near Nevada. When he asked if there were other older sites, maybe from the 50s or 60s, tucked away in the mountains, she just shrugged. "Lots of empty land out here, mister. Government owns most of it. They do what they do. Nobody asks too many questions." Her lack of specific knowledge was itself telling. Area 51 had generated legends. This place, if it existed, had generated only silence. He spent several days driving the county roads, getting a feel for the isolation. He noticed something subtle. The maintained roads ended much further out from the wilderness boundary than usual for this type of terrain. Unmarked, well-maintained dirt roads branched off into restricted areas, lacking the usual signage indicating missile ranges or bombing practice areas. Just standard government property, no trespassing signs. On one such road, a clean, late-model pickup truck, much newer and shinier than the beat-up vehicles of local ranchers, was parked idly. As Thorne drove past slowly, the driver, wearing mirrored sunglasses and a neutral expression, simply watched him. No challenge, no wave, just observation. It was a subtle assertion of presence, a quiet warning. Thorne continued on, not lingering. The feeling of being watched persisted long after he had passed the truck. He consulted his maps again, triangulating his position. He was getting closer to the area where the old geological map showed the unimproved road heading into the canyon system. The historical satellite imagery showed that the significant activity was focused around that specific canyon entrance and plateau. He decided to approach the area on foot from a different direction, parking his car miles away off a rough track used by hunters, out of season, and hiking cross-country towards a vantage point overlooking the canyon mouth, staying well outside any obvious restricted boundaries shown on current public maps. This required scrambling over rocky terrain, navigating washes, and being mindful of wildlife, but it kept him away from roads where surveillance might be expected. The sun was beginning to set by the time he reached a ridge offering a panoramic view of the target canyon system. The landscape was rugged, broken, a maze of cliffs and narrow ravines painted in hues of red and brown by the lowering sun. It was the kind of place where something could be hidden in plain sight, swallowed by the immensity of the geology. He set up his observation post behind a cluster of rocks, retrieved his binoculars, and began scanning the area below. The canyon mouth was a deep cut in the earth, shadowed even in the afternoon light. He focused on the area where the old, unimproved road likely entered the canyon. There was no road visible from this distance, but he could see a faint scar on the landscape, overgrown in places, suggesting its former path. Further in, where the satellite images had hinted at activity, the canyon walls seemed to converge. He saw no buildings, no antennas, no obvious signs of habitation or current activity, just rock and scrub. He scanned the high plateau area overlooking the canyon. Again, nothing obvious. It seemed utterly deserted, just as the public maps suggested. Disappointment began to gnaw at him. Had he followed a historical ghost? Had Project CHALICE and its Basin Annex been a short-lived failure, dismantled and erased decades ago? He took out the electromagnetic field meter. It was a sensitive piece of equipment designed to detect subtle fluctuations in magnetic fields and stray electromagnetic radiation. He turned it on. The baseline readings were low, as expected for such a remote location, consistent with natural terrestrial magnetism and distant radio signals. He swept the meter across the landscape before him, towards the canyon and the plateau. As he pointed it towards the suspected location deep within the canyon, the needle twitched. Not dramatically, but distinctly, showing a subtle, broadband electromagnetic signature that was inconsistent with natural sources or distant conventional infrastructure. It fluctuated slightly, a low, steady hum invisible to the naked eye, unheard by the ear, but detected by the sensitive electronics. It wasn't strong, but it was there, emanating from within the depths of the canyon where nothing should be. It suggested a persistent artificial power source or active electronic equipment, buried or shielded. The needle's faint tremor sent a shiver down his spine despite the dry heat. It was the first tangible physical evidence he had found that something was or had been at that precise location, something beyond a temporary camp or a disused road. And the fact that the signal was present now, decades after the project supposedly went dark, reinforced the unsettling possibility. The twin wasn't just a historical curiosity. It might still be active. He stayed until dusk, continuing his observations. As the light faded, something else caught his eye. High above the canyon, far too high for conventional aircraft to be easily visible, a single faint contrail appeared against the darkening sky. It was unusually thin and seemed to dissipate almost instantly, unlike the lingering white lines left by commercial airliners. He raised his binoculars, straining to see the source. He glimpsed a shape, brief and indistinct against the twilight. It wasn't the swept-wing delta of a fighter jet or the familiar profile of a bomber. It was something different, smooth, elongated, with no visible wings or conventional control surfaces. It moved with impossible speed and silence, leaving only that wispy, ephemeral trace before vanishing into the gloom. Thorne lowered his binoculars, his heart pounding. He was a historian, a man of documents and dusty facts, not a ufologist. He rationalized. High-altitude drone? A new stealth aircraft? Something else entirely? But the combination, the faint, persistent electromagnetic signature from the ground and this silent, anomalous shape in the sky above, felt too coincidental. It felt like pieces of the same puzzle, a puzzle that suggested the Basin Annex wasn't merely a historical footnote, but a continuing reality. A twin to the public mystery of Area 51, focused on technologies that remained deeply secret, perhaps because they had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams or fears of their Cold War progenitors. He packed his gear in the gathering darkness, the silence of the desert now feeling less empty and more watchful. His research had just moved from theory to something far more tangible and potentially far more dangerous. The subtle electromagnetic signature and the fleeting observation of the unconventional aerial shape solidified Thorne's conviction. This wasn't just a defunct historical site. It was something still operational, but proving it required more than a historian's intuition and a borrowed EMF meter. He needed concrete, undeniable evidence. He returned to his temporary base in the small town, his mind racing with possibilities and risks. Publicly exposing something like this without irrefutable proof would likely brand him as a crackpot, destroying his academic credibility. Attempting to get closer carried obvious dangers, though he still didn't believe this facility housed anything as overtly hostile as aliens. If it was a US government project, the threat would be legal and systemic. Detention, questioning, confiscation of research, perhaps even charges related to trespassing or espionage, regardless of the true nature of his activities. He spent the next few days reviewing his strategy. Direct observation from a distance seemed the safest, albeit slowest, approach. He needed better equipment, not just binoculars, but a powerful telescope capable of recording images, potentially a thermal camera, and perhaps more sophisticated electronic surveillance gear, though acquiring and using such equipment without drawing attention was problematic. He also needed to understand the pattern of activity, if any existed. The fleeting observation of the aerial vehicle suggested operations might occur at specific times, perhaps at night or during certain atmospheric conditions. Thorne decided to approach the problem from a different angle, one more aligned with his historical research skills, finding someone connected, however tangentially, to the site's past or present operations. He wasn't looking for a whistleblower with blueprints, but perhaps a retired contractor, a long-gone support worker, or even a descendant of someone who lived in the area when the site was supposedly active. These individuals might hold pieces of the puzzle, fragmented memories or local lore that could be cross-referenced with his findings. He returned to the dusty archives, focusing now on personnel records and contractor lists associated with Project CHALICE and the Basin Annex references. He found mentions of a construction company from Utah, defunct since the 1970s, listed as a primary contractor for site preparation and infrastructure. He found references to engineering firms specializing in underground construction and large-scale power systems. Tracking down individuals involved in these companies decades later was a painstaking process, often leading to dead ends, people who had moved, passed away, or whose records were lost. Persistence eventually paid off. He located the grandson of the foreman for the construction company mentioned in the records. The grandson, a man named Kevin, now ran a small, struggling general store in a town several hours away from Thorne's current location. Thorne visited him, presenting himself as a historian researching post-war infrastructure projects in the state. Kevin remembered his grandfather talking about a massive, difficult job in the back of beyond back in the late 50s. He never said exactly where, Kevin recalled, wiping dust from a shelf of canned goods. Just that it was way out past nowhere. Government job, top secret. Paid well, but they worked him hard. Said they were building something big, mostly underground or dug into the cliffs. Lots of concrete, lots of heavy equipment that had to be brought in special. He swore everyone working on it had to sign all sorts of papers, threats about never talking. Said it wasn't like building a regular base, more like building a vault or a bunker deep underground. A vault or a bunker deep underground. This aligned with Thorne's interpretation of the satellite imagery and the persistent low-level electromagnetic signature. An underground facility would explain the lack of visible surface structures and the difficulty in detecting it. It also suggested a purpose requiring significant shielding and security, perhaps related to advanced energy generation or containing dangerous experimental materials or processes. Kevin didn't know anything about what went on inside, just the construction. He did mention one peculiar detail his grandfather sometimes grumbled about. Said they had special trucks bringing in stuff under heavy guard, not construction materials, but big crates, sometimes glowing or humming faintly, usually at night. Called them the ghost trucks. This detail, easily dismissed as an old man's embellishments, resonated with Thorne's suspicion about the project's focus on exotic energy or physics. Simultaneously, Thorne was tracking down individuals associated with the engineering firms. He found a retired power systems engineer named Wallace Jenkins, now living in Arizona, who had worked for one of the mentioned companies in the early 1960s. Jenkins was more guarded, initially reluctant to talk about any government contracts. Thorne explained his historical research angle, emphasizing the time frame. Decades ago, focusing on the technical challenges of the era. After some persuasion, Jenkins grudgingly admitted to working on a project in the Great Basin involving large-scale power distribution and conditioning for a non-standard load. "Weirdest project I ever worked on," Jenkins said over the phone, his voice raspy with age. The power requirements were enormous, unlike anything civilian or even standard military installations needed. And the load profile, it wasn't constant like a radar dish or a base. It pulsed, surged, with weird harmonic distortions. We had to design custom transformers and converters. They called it Project CHALICE, though we never knew what CHALICE stood for. We built substations out in the middle of nowhere, ran lines into a canyon. Never saw the end-use equipment. Just knew it needed clean, high-voltage power in massive, fluctuating quantities. And there were requirements for redundant systems, shielding, things you'd only need if what you were powering was either incredibly sensitive or incredibly dangerous. Or both. Jenkins's account corroborated the underground facility idea and strongly supported the notion of a project focused on high-energy physics or novel power applications. The fluctuating, surging power requirements were particularly intriguing, suggestive of experimental processes rather than steady-state operations. He didn't know if the facility was still active, but he confirmed the scale of the original construction was substantial. Once it was built, Jenkins concluded, our company's involvement ended. Never heard another word about it. Like it vanished. Most secret thing we ever did. These two accounts, from individuals connected to the logistical and infrastructure aspects, painted a consistent picture. A massive, heavily shielded facility built deep within a remote canyon in the Great Basin in the late 1950s, early 1960s, requiring extraordinary power and handling unusual, potentially energetic materials. This wasn't Area 51 building faster planes. This sounded like something else entirely, something related to fundamental energy or propulsion research on a grand scale. Thorne returned to the vicinity of the suspected canyon, armed with this new information and slightly better observation equipment, a high-powered spotting scope with a digital camera adapter. He chose a new, more discreet vantage point, higher up the ridge system and further away, requiring a longer, more arduous hike. He arrived before dawn and settled in for a long day of observation. As the sun rose, illuminating the canyon, he scanned the area with the spotting scope. Still no obvious surface structures, but knowing what the historical accounts suggested, a deep, likely underground facility, he wasn't surprised. He focused on the plateau area overlooking the canyon mouth. It seemed bare, rocky, yet as the sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows, he noticed subtle irregularities on the plateau's surface. Not buildings, but perhaps disguised vents, access hatches or sensor arrays, skillfully camouflaged to blend with the natural rock and sparse vegetation. They were almost invisible, designed to be overlooked. He used his camera adapter to take dozens of high-resolution photos, hoping to analyze them later for patterns or details his eye might miss in the field. He spent the day monitoring the electromagnetic meter. The subtle, broadband signal was still there, unwavering, a silent testament to power flowing beneath the surface. In the afternoon, the signal seemed to pulse slightly, a rhythmic increase in amplitude lasting for about an hour before returning to its steady baseline. It was a small variation, easily missed, but suggestive of a cycle of activity within the facility. As dusk approached, he turned his attention back to the sky. He waited, watching the darkening horizon. Just after the last light faded, a faint, distant rumble reached his ears, too low to be thunder, too continuous to be an earthquake. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the canyon. A deep, resonant vibration felt more than heard. Then, silence returned. A few minutes later, higher in the sky than before, another anomalous aerial shape appeared. This time, he was ready with his spotting scope. It was difficult to track in the low light, but he managed to get fleeting views. The shape was the same. Smooth, dark, wingless. It moved with unnerving speed, making no sound at all as it traversed the sky. It performed maneuvers that seemed impossible for conventional aircraft. Sharp turns at high velocity, sudden changes in direction. It didn't leave a persistent contrail tonight, just a brief disturbance in the air visible only through the scope's magnification. It was clearer this time that this wasn't a standard aircraft, or even a known drone type. Its movement and silence were unlike anything publicly documented. This, combined with the evidence of the deeply buried facility and the unusual power signatures, painted a picture far more compelling and disturbing than just a secret airbase. This was a place potentially dealing with fundamental forces, perhaps related to propulsion or energy generation that bypassed conventional physics. And the craft he was observing might be a direct application of that research. The twin to Area 51 wasn't building faster jets. It was potentially building something that defied known principles of flight. And it was unquestionably still active, operating in the shadows. Its existence hinted at only by faint historical breadcrumbs, a persistent electromagnetic whisper, and silent shapes in the night sky. Thorne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air. He was witnessing something profound, and he was witnessing it from a precarious distance. The veil of secrecy was thick, but it wasn't entirely impenetrable. Thorne knew he couldn't stay in one location observing indefinitely. Security protocols, however discreet, would eventually detect a persistent presence, even miles away. He had enough initial data points: historical context, logistical trails, anecdotal accounts, and his own field observations, the subtle physical signs on the plateau, the persistent electromagnetic signature with its intriguing fluctuations, and the sightings of the unconventional aerial vehicle. It was a circumstantial case, strong for a historian but not definitive proof in a legal or journalistic sense. He needed to process what he had and plan the next phase, which had to involve a deeper level of analysis and perhaps attempting to find someone with more direct technical knowledge, however unlikely that seemed. He returned to his temporary accommodation, a rented room above a quiet general store in a town further afield. He downloaded the photos from his camera and began examining them on his laptop. Using image processing software, he enhanced the details on the plateau. The subtle irregularities became clearer. Faint geometric patterns in the rock formations, discolorations suggesting different types of concrete or composite materials blending seamlessly with the natural stone, cleverly disguised vents or ports. They were small, low profile, designed to escape casual observation from the air or ground. It wasn't a base. It was integrated into the mountain itself, a testament to sophisticated engineering and a paramount need for concealment. He analyzed the readings from the electromagnetic meter, correlating them with the time of the anomalous aerial sightings. The most distinct sighting occurred shortly after the meter showed a slight but noticeable increase in the broadband electromagnetic signal emanating from the canyon. This correlation, while not absolute proof, suggested the craft's operation was somehow linked to or powered by the facility below. It wasn't just an airframe being tested. It was a system, an integrated technology drawing power or receiving directional energy from its operational base. The phrase trans-medium vehicles from the old CHALICE documents came back to him. Could this craft operate in different environments? Air, space, perhaps even underwater? The idea seemed outlandish, but it fit the pattern of radical technological ambition suggested by the historical records and the unconventional nature of the observed vehicle. Thorne decided to delve back into the personnel records, but this time with a narrower focus. Individuals listed with technical roles on Project CHALICE or related obscure programs who might still be alive. He wasn't looking for administrators or construction workers, but engineers, physicists, technicians, people who would have known what the project was trying to achieve and how. This was even harder than tracing contractors. Many records from that era were incomplete. Names were redacted, or individuals had adopted new identities after leaving classified work. Through painstaking cross-referencing of partial names, dates of employment, and associated university departments or corporations known for classified research, he identified a handful of possibilities. One name stood out: Dr. Elias Thorne. The same last name, though a common one. The dates of employment on a vaguely related project document from the early 1960s placed him within the CHALICE timeframe. A search for Elias Thorne revealed a renowned but reclusive theoretical physicist who had worked on advanced propulsion concepts for NASA and various defense contractors during the Cold War. He had published several groundbreaking papers in the 1960s and 70s on field theory and vacuum energy, before abruptly retiring from public life in the early 1980s. His last known address was a remote property in the Pacific Northwest. Elias Thorne felt a jolt of intuition. Could Elias Thorne be related? A distant cousin, perhaps? More importantly, was he connected to CHALICE and Basin Annex? His theoretical work on advanced propulsion and energy acquisition aligned perfectly with the keywords Thorne had found in the historical documents. Finding him and getting him to talk, however, would be a significant challenge. Renowned, reclusive scientists who worked on classified projects rarely welcome unannounced visitors, especially those asking questions about decades-old secrets. While planning his approach to contacting Elias Thorne, Elias continued his research into the region surrounding the suspected site. He looked for subtle changes over the decades: land ownership transfers to shell corporations, changes in water rights, unexpected infrastructure upgrades, like high-capacity fiber optic cables running through seemingly nowhere. He found evidence of significant land parcels around the canyon mouth and plateau being acquired by anonymous trusts or corporations with registered agents in distant states. Acquisitions that occurred not just in the 1950s, 60s, but surprisingly, also in the late 1980s and 1990s. This suggested continued, perhaps even expanded, operational security around the site long after Chalice supposedly ended. It reinforced the still active nature of the twin. He also noticed something else on more recent, high-resolution satellite imagery available through commercial providers. Though the plateau and canyon entrance were masterfully disguised, faint vehicle tracks were visible in the less rocky soil further up the canyon floor. Tracks that didn't lead to any known public roads or trails, disappearing into the shadows of the cliff face where the old maps showed nothing but impassable terrain. These weren't the faint, overgrown traces of the 1960s road. These were newer, suggesting ongoing, clandestine access routes, possibly leading to disguised entrances deeper within the canyon. He decided to try a limited, carefully planned, nocturnal observation from a different, more elevated ridge miles away, using his spotting scope modified with a night vision attachment borrowed, under another plausible pretext, from a wildlife researcher. Approaching the area at night significantly increased the risks: getting lost, accidents in the dark, or encountering nocturnal security patrols. But it also offered the possibility of observing activities that might only occur under the cover of darkness. He parked his SUV over 10 miles away, hidden amongst scrub brush far from any road. He hiked for hours under a starry, moonless sky, navigating by GPS, compass, and the faint contours of the land. The desert at night was a different world, silent, cold, vast. He reached his chosen observation point, a high, windswept ridge overlooking the general area, several miles closer than his previous spot, but still a safe distance away. He set up his scope, scanning the dark landscape below. He focused on the area of the canyon entrance and the plateau. For hours, he saw nothing but the play of starlight and shadow on the rocks. The electromagnetic meter perched on a rock beside him showed the same faint, steady signal. Then, deep within the canyon, where the recent vehicle tracks disappeared into the cliff face, he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air, like heat haze, despite the cold night. It grew slightly, resolving into a faint outline of disturbed air. Then, silently, a section of the cliff face itself seemed to dissolve, like a perfectly camouflaged door sliding open. From the blackness within, a soft, diffused light emerged, followed by the slow, silent movement of a large object. It was the same shape as the aerial vehicle he had seen before. Smooth, elongated, wingless. It didn't roll out on wheels or tracks. It seemed to hover just above the ground, gliding forward. As it cleared the hidden entrance, the soft light intensified briefly, illuminating the area directly around the craft before dimming again. The cliff face behind it shimmered and reformed, the camouflage restoring itself perfectly, leaving no visible trace of an opening. The craft ascended vertically from the canyon floor, silent and steady, a dark shape against the slightly less dark sky. It paused for a moment at the lip of the canyon, perhaps 50 feet above the ground, hovering absolutely motionless. The electromagnetic meter beside Thorne showed a significant, though brief, spike in activity, correlating precisely with the craft's pause and ascent. Then, with no sound, no jet wash, no visible means of propulsion, it accelerated vertically at an astonishing rate, disappearing upwards into the night sky faster than any helicopter or conventional VTOL aircraft he knew of. Within seconds, it was gone, a phantom rising from the earth. Thorne watched in stunned silence, his breath misting in the cold air. This was it. This was the proof. A hidden base, capable of concealing the passage of large objects, and a craft that defied conventional physics, capable of silent vertical ascent and incredible acceleration without visible means of propulsion. This wasn't just a twin to Area 51. In terms of technological advancement, it seemed generations ahead of the projects developed at Groom Lake. Area 51 tested aircraft. This place was operating vehicles that seemed to nullify gravity and manipulate space-time itself, or at least exploit forces utterly unknown to the public. The legend of Area 51 was about our secret planes and potential alien visitors. The reality of Basin Annex, or whatever its true name was, seemed to be about our secret mastery of physics that blurred the line with what the public considered alien. And it was undeniably, frighteningly, still active. Thorne felt a profound sense of awe and dread. He had found his twin, and it was far more mysterious and advanced than he could have imagined. Now came the impossible question: what to do with this knowledge? The visual confirmation of the hidden entrance and the silent, vertical launch of the unconventional craft was a turning point. It elevated Elias Thorne's investigation from historical curiosity and circumstantial evidence to direct, albeit distant, observation of an active, deeply secret program. He had seen the twin emerge from its lair, the sheer technological capability on display, perfect camouflage, silent operation, and propulsion defying known principles, was staggering. It wasn't just advanced. It felt like science fiction made real. Precisely the kind of radical breakthrough hinted at in the most obscure Chalice documents. The experience was also unnerving. The silence and precision of the operation were more intimidating than any overt display of force. It spoke of total control, deep resources, and a level of secrecy that permeated the very landscape. He packed up his gear carefully, the desert night feeling heavier, more watchful than before. The long hike back to his hidden vehicle was done with heightened awareness, every rustle of brush, every distant animal sound seeming amplified, his mind replaying the impossible ascent of the dark shape. Back at his temporary base, Thorne began organizing his findings. He had time-stamped photos, albeit distant ones, of the disguised plateau surface and the approximate location of the hidden entrance. He had the electromagnetic meter readings showing the low baseline hum and the correlation with the craft's activity. He had the historical documents pointing to Project CHALICE and Basin Annex, and the anecdotal accounts from the construction foreman's grandson and the power engineer. And he had his own eyewitness observations of the craft itself, its form and performance. Alone, each piece might be dismissed. The documents were fragmented and old. The anecdotes were hearsay. The EMF signal could be attributed to unknown geological or military sources. The photos were distant and open to interpretation. The sightings could be dismissed as misidentification or fabrication, especially the silent, wingless description. But together, they formed a cohesive, disturbing narrative. A half-century-old secret project focused on revolutionary physics had resulted in a functional, operational technology housed in a hidden, purpose-built facility, and was still actively developing and deploying vehicles that defied conventional understanding. He returned to his research on Dr. Elias Thorne. The possibility that this reclusive physicist, known for work on exotic propulsion theory, was connected to the site felt increasingly significant. Elias decided he had to attempt contact. It was a long shot, potentially risky, but Elias Thorne represented the most likely source of information about the purpose and technology behind the twin. Locating Elias Thorne's property in the remote Pacific Northwest was difficult but not impossible using public records and geological survey maps. Getting access was another matter. The property was large, gated, and secluded. Elias debated his approach. Showing up unannounced might trigger an immediate, negative reaction or worse, alert the very people who wanted this secret kept. Sending a letter or email might be ignored or intercepted. He decided on a cautious approach. He sent a carefully worded letter via certified mail to the address, introducing himself as a historian researching Cold War-era advanced technology projects. He mentioned Project CHALICE and the Basin Annex references in a general way, without revealing the extent of his recent findings. He expressed his admiration for Dr. Thorne's published work and politely requested an interview or correspondence regarding the historical context of his research during the late 50s and early 60s. It was vague enough not to sound threatening or expose his specific knowledge, while hopefully specific enough to pique the interest or concern of someone involved in CHALICE. Weeks passed with no response. Elias continued consolidating his data, writing detailed notes, securing backups of his research materials off-site. He felt a growing sense of isolation. He couldn't discuss this with colleagues without risking his reputation. He certainly couldn't go to the press without more irrefutable evidence, which was proving almost impossible to acquire safely. He was sitting on a monumental secret, one that challenged public understanding of technology and the capabilities of covert government programs. Then, a response arrived. Not a letter, but a small unmarked package delivered by courier. Inside was a single item, a well-worn, nondescript hardbound notebook, old but well-preserved. There was no note, no return address, nothing to indicate who sent it, though Elias strongly suspected it came from Elias Thorne. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes, complex equations, circuit diagrams, and observations, written in a precise scientific hand. It was clearly a lab notebook or a personal research journal. Elias began reading. The early entries dated back to the mid-1950s. They discussed theoretical frameworks for manipulating space-time metrics using high-intensity electromagnetic fields, generating localized gravitational effects, and tapping into what the author termed vacuum potential energy. The later entries became more applied, discussing experimental setups, power requirements, material science challenges, specifically materials capable of withstanding immense energy densities and fluctuating fields, and the engineering problems of containing and controlling these effects. The notebook didn't explicitly mention Project CHALICE or Basin Annex by name. Instead, it used code names: Project Null, Site P, the Chamber, the Nullifier. But the descriptions of the experiments, the scale of the power needed, the challenges of site selection, geological stability paramount, remote location essential, deep underground shielding beneficial, and the types of materials discussed, resonant composites, field-aligned alloys, aligned uncannily with every piece of evidence Elias had gathered about Basin Annex and the technology likely being pursued there. The entries detailed experiments involving generating intense, localized electromagnetic fields within a shielded chamber, observing effects on inertia, mass, and even gravitational fields within the chamber. They discussed attempts to achieve field propulsion, creating asymmetrical field distortions around an object to generate thrust without conventional reaction mass. There were diagrams of complex power conditioning systems and massive resonant cavities buried deep underground. One section detailed the design and testing of a proof-of-concept vehicle, PCV. The descriptions matched the shape and observed characteristics of the craft Elias had seen emerge from the canyon. Smooth form factor to minimize field disruption, internal resonant cavities for field generation, vertical and omnidirectional movement capability, silent operation due to lack of conventional propulsion. The entries also discussed the significant power requirements for the PCV's operation, noting that initial tests required drawing immense power from the facility's main reactor generator, explaining the power fluctuations Thorne had detected. The notebook was a goldmine, providing a technical blueprint for the impossible technology he had witnessed. It detailed not just the what, but the how and why. It confirmed that the project's goal was nothing less than manipulating fundamental forces for propulsion and energy. It explained the need for a deeply buried, heavily shielded facility. The chamber requires containment of resonant frequencies and protection from external interference. It implied the experiments were not only theoretically groundbreaking, but also potentially hazardous, requiring extreme isolation and safety measures. Critically, the later entries in the notebook dated into the late 1970s, discussing refinements to the PCV design and plans for scaling up the technology. This directly contradicted the idea that the project had ended in the 1960s. While the notebook itself likely ended with Elias Thorne's public retirement, the content strongly implied the work was ongoing and progressing. The arrival of the notebook, seemingly from Elias Thorne, was a deliberate act. It wasn't a casual response. It was the delivery of heavily guarded secrets. Why would a reclusive scientist, sworn to secrecy, do this? Perhaps he was old and felt the history needed to be known. Perhaps he was disillusioned with the project's direction or continued secrecy. Or perhaps he was sending a message, a warning, or even a test. Regardless of the motive, Elias now held in his hands a key that could unlock the true nature of America's hidden twin, a facility not housing alien artifacts, but the stunning terrestrial result of decades of top-secret research into physics that could redefine transportation, energy, and potentially power. The realistic implications were far more profound and disturbing than any alien conspiracy. This was human technology, developed in secret, and its continued operation raised immense questions about its purpose, its risks, and its place in the world. Holding the notebook felt like holding a piece of the future or an alternate present that had been deliberately hidden. Elias Thorne meticulously scanned and digitized every page, creating encrypted copies. He knew the original notebook itself was invaluable, but also a potential liability if discovered. Its presence in his possession, linked to his inquiries about Chalice, could tie him directly to the leak, assuming it was indeed leaked by Elias Thorne. The notebook filled in many gaps, explaining the type of technology being pursued, confirming the need for a massive, shielded facility, and linking it directly to revolutionary physics. It described a world of manipulating space-time, inertial mass, and vacuum energy, concepts that remained largely theoretical or fringe in mainstream science even today. The fact that a government project in the 50s and 60s was seriously pursuing and seemingly achieving breakthroughs in these areas was astounding. It suggested a divergence between public science and classified science that was far wider than generally assumed. But the notebook didn't explain the current status of the project in detail, beyond implying it continued past the 1970s. It didn't detail the full operational scope, the specific projects being worked on now, or the scale of the facility. And critically, it didn't explain why. It was still active and secret in an era when other Cold War technologies had been declassified, retired, or integrated into public life. Elias reasoned that Elias Thorne sending the notebook was a calculated risk. It was a passive disclosure, placing the burden of what to do with the information onto Elias. It was a test of his discretion and his understanding. It also suggested that Dr. Thorne himself was either unable or unwilling to reveal the secret more directly, perhaps still bound by security oaths or fear for his safety. Elias decided his next step needed to be more about verifying the present-day operations and scale, using the technical information from the notebook to guide his observations. The notebook mentioned specific energy frequencies and field harmonics associated with the nullifier and the PCV. If he could detect these specific signatures, it would provide undeniable evidence that the technology described in the notebook was still operational at the Basin Annex site. This required more specialized equipment, a spectrum analyzer capable of detecting specific electromagnetic frequencies and patterns, potentially operating in unusual parts of the spectrum. Acquiring such equipment discreetly was difficult. He couldn't buy it online or from a standard electronics store. He reached out to a contact in the amateur radio and electronics world, a brilliant but eccentric engineer named Clara Vance, whom he had met years ago at a technical history conference. Clara had a reputation for building custom equipment for obscure purposes. Elias fabricated a story about needing to detect unusual geological radio emissions for a fictional academic project. He provided vague specifications based on his understanding of the notebook's frequencies, describing them as low-power, high-harmonic, transient signals in the low gigahertz range, possibly with unusual polarization. Clara, intrigued by the technical challenge, agreed to build a prototype receiver and spectrum analyzer for him, asking few questions but looking at him with a new, speculative glint in her eye. While Clara worked on the equipment, Elias spent more time studying the satellite imagery and geological maps around the Basin Annex. He overlaid the old maps with new ones, looking for any discrepancies. He noticed subtle changes in road patterns, areas where older tracks had been erased or rerouted, and new, faint lines suggesting buried conduits or tunnels radiating outwards from the central canyon area, far too subtle to be easily visible without precise comparison. This hinted at a much larger underground complex than just the initial chamber described in the early notebook entries. A network of tunnels, perhaps connecting to multiple surface access points or even extending many miles underground. The Twin wasn't just a secret base. It was potentially an underground city dedicated to this exotic technology. He also investigated the unusual land acquisitions more deeply. The shell corporations and trusts acquiring land around the site in recent decades were linked through complex chains of ownership to larger holding companies with names like Desert Sands Holdings, Canyon Mesa Resources, and Basin View Properties. These companies had no public profile, no obvious business activities other than land acquisition, and their legal structures were designed for maximum opacity. This was classic behavior for government-linked front companies acquiring buffer zones or strategic access points. Weeks later, Clara delivered the custom-built spectrum analyzer. It was a compact, rugged device with a directional antenna and a digital display, looking more like something from a spy movie than a scientific instrument. "This should pick up your geological signals," Clara said with a smirk. "Though I gotta say, Elias, those frequency characteristics are weird. Nothing I've seen naturally occurring. What exactly are you listening for out there?" Elias gave a non-committal answer, thanking her profusely. Clara's curiosity was piqued, which was both helpful, she built great gear, and potentially dangerous. She might start asking harder questions or even investigate herself. Armed with the spectrum analyzer and his growing knowledge from the notebook, Elias planned his next field trip. He wouldn't try to observe the hidden entrance directly again. Instead, he would position himself several miles away on a high point overlooking the entire canyon system. Somewhere he could run the spectrum analyzer undisturbed for extended periods, correlating readings with time and any distant visual or auditory observations. He returned to the Great Basin. The vast emptiness now felt different. It felt inhabited, not by towns or people, but by a deep, hidden technological presence. He hiked to his chosen spot, a remote peak he'd identified on the maps that offered a wide view and seemed unlikely to be frequented by anyone. He set up a small, camouflaged camp, designed for minimal impact and visibility. He turned on the spectrum analyzer. The display flickered, showing a low level of background radio noise. He aimed the directional antenna towards the suspected location of the Basin Annex. Almost immediately, the display showed a series of faint, repeating spikes at the exact frequencies and harmonic patterns described in Elias Thorne's notebook. They were low in power, heavily shielded, but they were undeniably present, confirming that the nullifier technology or something directly related to it was operating within the canyon. He spent the next several days monitoring the signals. They weren't constant. They pulsed and varied in intensity, sometimes disappearing for hours, sometimes spiking dramatically. He correlated the spikes with times when he thought he heard faint, distant sounds from the canyon area, low rumbles, resonant vibrations, or when he observed subtle disturbances in the air visible through his binoculars, brief shimmers or distortions that might indicate localized field effects. One night, the signal spiked and held at a high level for over an hour. Shortly after, he saw it again. The silent, dark shape lifting vertically from the canyon area. Much faster this time, a mere blur against the stars before vanishing. The spectrum analyzer readings perfectly correlated with the craft's brief presence above the canyon. It wasn't drawing all its power from the base constantly, but the base seemed essential for its launch, perhaps charging internal power systems or establishing a necessary field resonance. The cumulative evidence was now overwhelming. The historical record, the geological and satellite data, the anecdotal accounts, Elias Thorne's technical notebook, and his own field observations and electronic detections all pointed to the same conclusion. America had a second, even more secret twin to Area 51, hidden deep underground, focused on physics-defying technology, and it was not only still active, but seemed to be operating at a high level of technological maturity. The secrecy was total, the capabilities astounding, and its continued existence after decades raised profound questions about what else the government was hiding, and what the true state of classified technology was. Elias Thorne had found his white whale, and it was larger, deeper, and more actively elusive than he had ever imagined. What was his next move? The world needed to know. But how could he reveal a truth so far beyond belief, guarded by such power and secrecy? Elias Thorne knew he had reached a critical juncture. He possessed compelling evidence of an extraordinary, deeply hidden reality, but no easy way to share it. Going public through traditional academic channels was impossible. The claims were too radical, the evidence too circumstantial for peer review, and the likely government response would be immediate discrediting or silencing. Leaking information to the press was risky. Without absolute proof, it would be dismissed, and even with proof, the source would be relentlessly hunted. Handing his findings to a trusted journalist or organization might spread the risk, but also meant losing control of the narrative and potentially endangering others. He considered the ethical implications. Was he obligated to reveal this secret? This technology, whatever its purpose, had been developed and maintained in absolute secrecy for over half a century, consuming immense resources without public knowledge or oversight. What were its applications? Energy? Transportation? Or something with military implications far exceeding conventional warfare? The potential benefits, or dangers, were immense. Keeping it hidden felt wrong, but revealing it could have unpredictable and potentially destabilizing consequences, both technologically and politically. His thoughts kept returning to Elias Thorne. The delivery of the notebook wasn't just a leak. It felt personal, perhaps a message meant specifically for Elias, given his research focus. Elias revisited the notebook, searching for any hint of Elias Thorne's current state of mind, his motivations, or his perspective on the project. The later entries, while still technical, contained subtle notes of frustration. Phrases like persistent challenges with containment resonance, stability, increasing pressure for application viability over fundamental understanding, and the ethical implications of scaled-up field manipulation remain unaddressed, suggested internal conflict. There was a brief, poignant entry. We sought to touch the fabric of reality, but are we prepared for what touches back? This wasn't just a scientist. It was a man wrestling with the consequences of his work. Elias wondered if Elias Thorne intended for him to expose the secret, or simply to understand it, perhaps to bear witness. The method of delivery, a silent, untraceable package, felt like an act of conscience from someone still trapped within the system's constraints. Elias decided his immediate priority should be to secure his data and consolidate his findings into a comprehensive report, a document that could stand on its own even if something happened to him. He spent weeks structuring the information: historical context, documented evidence, declassified snippets, procurement records, satellite imagery analysis, anecdotal testimony, and his own field data, EMF logs, photo analysis, observation notes, culminating in the technical insights gleaned from the notebook and his detection of the specific energy signatures. He wrote it like a formal historical and investigative report, sober and factual, deliberately avoiding sensational language or speculation beyond what the evidence directly supported. He created multiple encrypted copies of the report and all supporting data, storing them in various secure, geographically separate locations, including sending copies to trusted colleagues with instructions on what to do if he disappeared, or if they received a specific, pre-arranged signal. He was taking precautions, acknowledging the potential danger his knowledge represented. While securing his data, he continued passive observation of the Basin Annex area, primarily through monitoring satellite imagery feeds and publicly available seismic data for unusual activity. He noticed that the subtle EMF signals he had detected were now more consistent, present for longer periods throughout the day, and occasionally spiked with greater intensity than before. This suggested increased activity within the facility, perhaps testing or operation of systems on a larger scale. He also noticed a subtle increase in security presence in the region. Not overt patrols on public roads, but reports from local newspapers about increased ranger presence on adjacent public lands, unexplained temporary closures of hiking trails, and a few vague mentions on local online forums about seeing unmarked helicopters operating in the remote mountain areas. They weren't looking for him specifically, not yet. But the overall security footprint was tightening. The question of why the project remained active and secret after so long gnawed at him. Was it purely military? A new generation of stealth or strike platforms? Was it energy-related? A breakthrough that could render fossil fuels obsolete but was being kept under wraps for strategic or economic reasons? Or was it something even more fundamental, related to the scientific capabilities themselves, granting an unprecedented advantage in areas like surveillance, communication, or even climate control? The notebook hinted at propulsion and energy, but the full scope remained unknown. Elias felt a growing conviction that he needed to attempt contact with Elias Thorne one more time. perhaps through a more secure, indirect method. He speculated that the delivery of the notebook might have been a test or a precursor to further communication. He thought about the few public details available about Dr. Thorne's retirement, his interest in astronomy, his philanthropic donations to quiet scientific foundations. He drafted another letter to Elias Thorne, sent this time through a complex series of dead drops and intermediaries, contacts he had cultivated over years of investigating sensitive historical topics, people who valued discretion. This letter was more direct. He confirmed receipt and understanding of the notebook's content, without specifying how he received it. He described his field observations and detection of the correlated EMF signatures, demonstrating he hadn't just read the notebook, but had independently found evidence of the technology's continued operation. He posed questions about the project's current status, its ultimate goals, and the reasons for the prolonged secrecy. He ended by stating his intention to reveal the information responsibly, but acknowledging the inherent difficulties and dangers, implicitly seeking Elias Thorne's guidance or assistance. Waiting for a response was agonizing. He continued his research, now focusing on the potential implications of the technology described in the notebook if it were operational at scale. A propulsion system that didn't require reaction mass would revolutionize space travel, rendering rockets obsolete. An energy source derived from vacuum potential could provide limitless, clean power. Field manipulation could have applications in medicine, manufacturing, communications, but in the hands of a secretive military or intelligence organization, these same capabilities could be used for unprecedented surveillance, rapid global force projection, or even weaponized in ways he couldn't imagine. The potential gap between this classified technology and the public domain was vast, representing a technological asymmetry that could fundamentally alter global power dynamics. One evening, as he was reviewing satellite imagery showing recent, subtle signs of increased vehicle traffic near the disguised access points of the Basin Annex, he noticed something new. A large, temporary exclusion zone had appeared on aviation charts covering the airspace directly above the canyon area. Not a standard military operations area, but a specific, temporary restriction for atmospheric research. This was often a cover story for classified air tests, but given the ground activity and the known nature of the site, it likely meant significant testing of the PCV or a similar craft was imminent. Suddenly, his secure phone, a disposable device he used for sensitive contacts, rang. The number was unknown, masked. He hesitated, then answered. "Dr. Thorne?" a voice asked. It was older, raspy, but clear. Educated. "Speaking," Elias replied, his heart pounding. "You received the material," the voice said. It wasn't a question. "I did," Elias confirmed. "Thank you. It was enlightening." "Enlightening and dangerous," the voice stated flatly. "You have been persistent, perhaps too persistent." "The history is incomplete," Elias said, choosing his words carefully. "And the present is extraordinary. The signals from the Basin Annex, they match the notebook." There was a pause. "Yes, they would. It is still active. More active than it has been in years." "Why?" Elias pressed. "Why is it still a secret? What are they doing now?" Another long pause. When the voice spoke again, it was softer, weary. "The reasons have changed over time. It began as national security, a race for an ultimate advantage. It continued because the technology was too powerful, too disruptive to release. Now, it has a life of its own, a culture of secrecy, self-preservation, and the current work. It is beyond the initial goals. They are not just building vehicles, Elias. They are exploring the implications of manipulating reality itself. And they believe the world is not ready, and perhaps never will be, for what they have found. Elias felt a cold dread spread through him. Manipulating reality, what does that mean? It means, the voice sighed, that the vacuum potential, the field effects, they touch things we do not fully understand. Space, time, perhaps consciousness itself. The twin was built to harness energy and defy gravity. It has become a place that probes the fundamental nature of existence. And the people who control it believe they are the only ones capable of managing that knowledge. But the risks, Elias asked, thinking of the notebook's warnings, the ethical implications. They are secondary to the potential, the voice said, a hint of bitterness now. And the control. They control the power, the knowledge, and they believe they must control the outcome. Area 51 hunted shadows. This place creates its own. Who are you? Elias asked, though he was almost certain he knew. Someone who helped build the cage, the voice replied, and now regrets what is contained within it. The notebook was an attempt, perhaps futile, to ensure that if the cage ever breaks or its inhabitants make a catastrophic error, someone outside knows what to look for. You were that someone. Dr. Thorne? Elias whispered, a faint chuckle. It has been many decades since I was just Dr. Thorne to those within the project. But yes, it is I. What should I do? Elias asked. You sent me the notebook. You know what I found. How can this secret be revealed? How can the world know? The phone line was silent for a long moment. Then Elias Thorne's voice, low and urgent. That is the question, isn't it? You have the evidence, the understanding, but exposing it will bring immense pressure, danger, to you and to anyone who helps you. They will not allow this to get out. They have spent too long ensuring its silence. But you want it out, Elias pressed. I want the truth to exist outside their control, Elias Thorne said. I am an old man, Elias. My time is short. I cannot fight them directly, but perhaps you can plant the seeds. Document everything. Leave a trail that cannot be erased. Make it undeniable for those who are willing to look. The temporary exclusion zone you saw, they are preparing for a significant test, something that will require immense power. It might be your best, or only, chance to get close enough, if you are careful, to gather irrefutable data. But it is extraordinarily risky. They will be on high alert. A significant test? Elias felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with fear. What kind of test? One that might demonstrate the scaled capability, Elias Thorne said. A significant manipulation of the local field. It will draw power like nothing before. The energy signature will be immense, briefly, hard to contain entirely. If you have that spectrum analyzer, you might register it even miles away. But getting any visual confirmation, that would require being closer than is safe. Think very carefully, Elias. You have already proven it exists. Do you risk everything to prove its current power? The call ended abruptly. Elias Thorne was left alone with the dial tone, the weight of the secret, and the terrifying prospect of a significant test at the hidden facility. Elias Thorne had confirmed everything, provided context, and given him a potential, albeit perilous, path forward. The twin was real, operational, and engaged in work that dwarfed the legends of Area 51. And it was about to perform a demonstration. Elias Thorne sat in silence, the desert night pressing in. The call from Elias Thorne had confirmed his deepest suspicions and layered on new, unsettling possibilities. The twin wasn't just a site for advanced propulsion. It was a place probing the very nature of reality, and its current work involved risks and capabilities far beyond his initial understanding. The prospect of a significant test was both terrifying and offered a potential opportunity for irrefutable evidence. Elias Thorne, the architect of the cage, seemed to be subtly guiding him towards a moment of vulnerability for the secret. He reviewed his options. Approaching the site during a high-alert test was almost suicidal. Security would be absolute, detection certain, capture or worse, highly probable. Yet Elias Thorne implied it might be the only time the energy signature would be powerful enough, or the field effects significant enough, to be detected unequivocally, even from a distance. This wasn't just about seeing a craft. It was about measuring the power and scope of the underlying technology. He decided against attempting to get physically closer to the canyon during the test. The risks were unacceptable. Instead, he would rely on his electronic equipment, the custom spectrum analyzer and a more sensitive magnetometer he also possessed. He needed to find a location that was as close as possible while remaining on clearly public land, far enough away to minimize physical detection risk, but close enough that the immense energy spike Elias Thorne described might register clearly on his instruments, overriding the background noise and the facility's shielding. He spent the next day poring over maps, scouting potential observation points. He found a remote, little-used hiking trail that led to a high ridge several miles south of the Basin Annex canyon, still within the temporary flight restriction zone but outside the immediate, most sensitive perimeter. It was public land, but reaching the specific point required a long, strenuous hike into rough terrain, reducing the chance of casual hikers or patrols stumbling upon him. He prepared his gear meticulously. The spectrum analyzer, the magnetometer, multiple recording devices with extra batteries and storage, a high-powered scope, primarily for documenting the surrounding landscape and any distant visual anomalies, camping gear, food, water, and emergency supplies. He traveled to the area well in advance of the predicted test window, which Elias Thorne hadn't specified but implied was imminent, linked to the temporary flight restriction. He parked his car a significant distance from the trailhead, leaving no obvious trace. The hike was brutal, cross-country for part of the way to avoid the main trail. He reached the chosen ridge late in the day, exhausted but positioned. The view was commanding, overlooking miles of the desolate basin and the distant, rugged mountain range concealing the Basin Annex. From this distance, the canyon mouth was barely visible, just a deeper shadow in the fading light. He set up his instruments, carefully positioning the antennas and sensors for optimal reception towards the target area. He started the recording devices, logging data continuously. The spectrum analyzer showed the familiar, low-level hum, the faint ghost of the active facility. The magnetometer registered the Earth's magnetic field with minor local variations. He settled in to wait. The first night passed uneventfully, marked only by the vast silence of the desert, broken occasionally by wind or distant wildlife. The instrument readings remained stable, the low hum a constant presence. The second day was hot and still. Elias scanned the sky and the distant landscape, seeing nothing unusual. He ate sparingly, conserving his supplies. The monotony was broken only by checking the instrument readouts and ensuring the recording devices were functioning. It happened on the third night, just before midnight. Suddenly, the spectrum analyzer's display flared. The faint spikes he was accustomed to seeing transformed into massive peaks, broadband and intense, centered around the frequencies mentioned in the notebook, but extending across a wide range. The signal strength was orders of magnitude higher than anything he had recorded before, overwhelming the background noise. It wasn't just coming from the direction of the canyon. It felt like the very air around him was vibrating with energy. Simultaneously, the magnetometer readings went wild. The needle swung violently, indicating a massive disruption of the local magnetic field, far exceeding any natural fluctuation or atmospheric effect. The reading didn't just change. It fluctuated rapidly, suggesting complex dynamic field manipulation. Elias looked towards the distant canyon. There was no visible light. No sound reached him from this distance. But the instrument screamed of immense power being unleashed. The energy signature was precisely what Elias Thorne had warned him about. Powerful enough to be detected even miles away, suggesting a test of scale, of a capability far beyond simply launching a vehicle. The intense readings lasted for several minutes, peaking and then slowly, erratically, subsiding. They didn't drop back to the low baseline hum immediately. Instead, they fluctuated at a level significantly higher than the baseline for another hour, like the facility's systems were recovering or stabilizing after a massive exertion. Then, as the instrument readings finally began to settle back towards their normal levels, Elias saw something in the sky, directly above the distant canyon. It wasn't the dark, silent shape of the craft this time. It was a subtle, yet unmistakable distortion of the stars. Like looking through imperfect glass, the pinpricks of light seemed to shimmer and bend in a localized area of the night sky above the mountain ridge. It wasn't an optical illusion. It was a visual effect of warped space, a localized gravitational or field anomaly affecting the light from distant stars. The distortion lasted for maybe 30 seconds, a window into a reality where physics bent to the will of unseen engineers. Then it vanished, the stars snapping back into their usual positions. Elias stared, breathless. The combination of the unprecedented instrument readings and the visual distortion confirmed it. They weren't just testing a vehicle. They were testing the fundamental field-manipulating technology described in the notebook, potentially at a scale that affected the local space-time fabric. This was the significant manipulation of the local field Elias Thorne had warned him about. He continued recording for the rest of the night, long after the readings had returned to their baseline. The data he had captured was conclusive, undeniable proof of the technology's existence and capability. It was the smoking gun, the concrete evidence that could, perhaps, finally force the secret into the light. Packing up his equipment in the pre-dawn gloom, Elias felt a mix of elation and profound responsibility. He had succeeded. He had obtained the evidence. But now came the hardest part: disseminating it safely and effectively to a world that wouldn't believe it without seeing the raw data. Data that pointed to a reality far stranger and more advanced than any fictional account of Area 51. He was no longer just a historian uncovering a hidden past. He was a custodian of a present-day secret that had the potential to change everything. The twin was real. It was active, and its capabilities were breathtakingly, terrifyingly advanced. Now, he had to find a way to tell its story, and hope the forces that had kept it hidden for so long didn't silence him before he could. The test was over, but Elias Thorne's real challenge had just begun. The long hike back felt different. The weight he carried was no longer just his gear, but the immense burden of a truth too extraordinary to keep secret and too dangerous to reveal. Elias Thorne successfully navigated the treacherous hike back. The memory of the bending starlight and the screaming instruments burned into his mind. He reached his hidden vehicle without incident, the quiet return feeling anticlimactic after the raw power he had witnessed from afar. The desert was waking up, innocent and unaware of the forces that had momentarily warped the reality above it just hours before. Back at his temporary safe location, he immediately began the process of offloading and securing the data from his instruments. The files containing the spectrum analyzer readings and magnetometer logs were dense, filled with numbers and graphs. But the spikes were unmistakable, correlated precisely in time. This was the hard evidence, the quantitative proof that couldn't be dismissed as a visual anomaly or a misinterpretation. He cross-referenced the timestamps with the precise time he had observed the stellar distortion. Everything aligned. He added this new data to his growing report, integrating the technical readings with his observations and the information from Elias Thorne's notebook. The report was now a comprehensive case study of a hidden reality, meticulously documented and cross-referenced. It was robust, designed to withstand scrutiny, but its very claims would challenge the credulity of anyone outside the classified world. The question remained, how to release it? A direct public dump of the technical data without context would be meaningless to most and immediately flagged by intelligence agencies. A narrative account without the data would be dismissed as a fantasy. He needed a way to present both, to provide the story and the undeniable numbers. He thought about his contact, Clara Vance, the eccentric engineer who built his spectrum analyzer. She had been intrigued by the unusual frequencies. Perhaps she could help validate the technical data, lend it credibility from the scientific community, but involving her would put her at risk. He considered approaching journalists known for handling sensitive leaks, but the sheer scale and nature of this secret felt different from political scandals or military procurement issues. This touched on fundamental physics and potentially existential capabilities. Elias Thorne's words echoed in his mind. Leave a trail that cannot be erased. Make it undeniable for those who are willing to look. This suggested a dispersed, multi-pronged approach rather than a single big reveal. Elias decided on a strategy involving layered disclosure and redundancy. He spent the next weeks implementing this plan. He carefully crafted the anonymized technical data package for his academic contacts, focusing solely on the unusual characteristics of the energy spike and field distortion. He wrote a cover letter framing it as a scientific anomaly requiring explanation. He refined his comprehensive report, honing the narrative flow, making the complex historical and technical information as clear as possible. He wrote cover notes for the journalists and NGOs, explaining the significance of the document and the need for discretion. He used anonymous email addresses and digital dead drops to deliver the files. He set up the secure archives, sharing encryption keys and instructions with his most trusted colleagues, emphasizing the sensitivity and potential danger. Throughout this process, he felt the pressure mounting. The increased security presence in the Basin Annex area was palpable even from afar, evident in the frequency of unmarked flights and the reports of temporary restrictions. He knew that the test he witnessed, while providing him with data, had likely also heightened the awareness of the facility's operators. They would be analyzing their own data from the event, and any anomalies, like unusual remote energy detections, might trigger investigations. One day, as he was working in his rented room, a car pulled up outside. It wasn't a standard police vehicle. It was a black, unmarked SUV, similar to the one he had seen parked on the restricted road months ago. Two men in plain clothes got out. They didn't look like local law enforcement. They had a quiet, professional demeanor that spoke of training and authority that wasn't publicly acknowledged. Elias felt a jolt of pure fear. They had found him. Whether through tracking his digital footprint, his rental car, or simply by systematically identifying and locating anyone who had shown unusual interest in the region, they were here. Elias Thorne's warning about the danger was not theoretical. He had mere seconds. He slammed his laptop shut, grabbed the external hard drive containing his most critical data backups and the full report, and moved towards the back exit, a window leading onto a small, rickety fire escape. There was no time to grab anything else. As the men knocked sharply on his front door, Elias scrambled out the window and down the fire escape. He hit the ground running, moving into the narrow alleyway behind the building. He could hear shouts from the front as they likely forced entry. He ran, blending into the back streets of the small town, aiming for the edge of town and the open country beyond. He didn't know if his layered disclosure had been successful yet. Had the academics received the data? Had the journalists accessed the report? Had his secure archives been compromised? He only knew he was now a fugitive, hunted by the very forces that guarded the secret of the twin. He ran through the brush, the dry desert air burning his lungs. He didn't know if he would escape, if he would be caught, if his work would ever see the light of day. But he had done everything he could. He had found the twin, documented its existence and its extraordinary capabilities, and sent its story out into the world through multiple channels. The secret was no longer solely contained within the Basin Annex. It was out there, fragmented perhaps, but present. As he ran, a thought formed in his mind, a chilling possibility based on Elias Thorne's last words. What if the significant test hadn't gone perfectly? What if the manipulation of reality had unintended consequences? He glanced back towards the distant mountains concealing the Basin Annex, half expecting to see another distortion in the sky, a sign that the power unleashed was not fully under control. He saw nothing but the stoic, indifferent peaks. He ran on, the hard drive clutched in his hand, the dry dust of the desert settling on his face. He had pulled on a thread of history and uncovered a reality that was more profound, more technologically advanced, and more dangerously secret than any legend. America's Zone 51 had a twin, and it was still active, still pushing the boundaries of the possible, hidden from the world, its secrets guarded by silence, technology, and now, by men hunting him in the desert. His fate was uncertain, but the truth he had uncovered was no longer entirely his own. It was now a ghost in the machine of public consciousness, waiting to be found, waiting to be believed.